So good afternoon, everyone. Good evening to those who have joined us from Hong Kong. A very warm welcome to today's session. We are looking at what does mutual trust and cooperation actually mean. So my name is Megan Hailwood, and I am the Junior Business Development Manager here at Digital Beehive, and I will be your host for today. It's a very interesting topic. It's something that we think will create a lot of questions. So we'd really encourage you to ask those, add them into the Q&A, and then we will address them during the Q&A segment towards the end of the session. So today I am joined by a panel of specialists who combined bring many, many years of experience in the construction industry and a lot of interesting perspectives. We have Tim Leung, who is the founder and director of Apex Tech Solutions in Hong Kong, with over 30 years of experience in infrastructure construction and NEC implementation. He has led multiple award-winning NEC projects recognised by the Martin Barnes Awards in 2023. Congratulations there. And was runner-up for the NEC Business Leader of the Year in 2024. Tim currently serves on the HKIAC panel of adjudicators. Welcome, Tim. Sean Leung is also joining us. He is currently in his penultimate year of a philosophy degree at University College London, with particular interest in ethical theory, political philosophy, and the philosophical dimensions of institutions and contractual systems. A lot of really interesting topics there for me, Sean, because there's a lot of overlap there with what I've looked at during my philosophy degree as well. So that this is going to be particularly interesting for me. You have co-authored papers on NEC governance and collaborative procurement, including research relating to NEC 4 Clause 10.2 and collaborative governance, which we'll be looking at today. We are also joined by Glenn Hide, who is widely recognised within the construction industry as one of the leading NEC contract and project planning experts. He brings over 30 years of experience working in the construction industry on a wide range of construction projects. He's successfully controlled the planning, costs, and project management from inception to closeout of many large projects, which have been exclusively under the NEC contract form. So a big thank you and welcome to all of our hosts. Very, very interesting perspectives and a wide range of expertise to be shared. So without further ado, rather than me chatting on and on, I'm going to hand over to Glenn, who will walk us through the agenda. So over to you, Glenn.
Excellent. Thanks, Megan. I'm really pleased to be here with everyone. I'm just going to set the scene, and then I'm going to hand over to Sean to start to think about some of the more sort of philosophical. I can't even say that. I certainly don't have a philosophy degree. So we're going to look at try and really get into the core of this sort of subject, because people talk a lot about collaboration. But it doesn't actually appear in the core clauses of the contract. And very often people even talk about, they think the contract talks about the spirit of mutual trust and collaboration. They kind of misquote the clause sometimes as well. So this phrase, to act in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation, first came into NEC way back in 1995 in NEC 2. So it wasn't in the original contract. The first contracts come out in 93. It wasn't there originally. It didn't fail without it. But one of the Latham recommendations way back in 1994, he strongly endorsed the NEC contracts, although it was only a year old at that point. But he did make a few recommendations. One was a name change. So the new engineering contract became the engineering and construction contract. And also this obligation, this requirement to act in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation was born. So it was introduced in 1995 into then NEC 2. And it was maintained in NEC 3. Now, originally in those contracts, it just appeared in one single clause 10.1. So it talked about the parties acting as stated in the contract and in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. But then NEC 4 decided to separate these out just to make it clear that they are separate obligations. In NEC 3 training, I'd often highlight the word and, because it started off by saying the parties act as stated in the contract. It talked about this requirement to act in a spirit, mutual trust and cooperation, and the word that brought those two together was the word and. And I'd say it doesn't say or, so it's not a choice. It says and. And I think to emphasize that point, NEC4 then split it into two separate obligations to really crystallize that this is two separate obligations and you don't get a choice. So that's why NEC4, we now see these as two separate clauses. So 10.1, the parties, the project manager and the supervisor, shall act as stated in this contract, full stop. Obligation number one. 10.2, the same people, the parties, the project manager, the supervisor, act in this spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. So Sean, take us back. Where do you think this sort of phrase stems from and how should we be applying it in our industry?
Thank you, Glenn. Well, before we start on the philosophical aspect of this, I think we just want to give our viewers and listeners just a quick overview of, the structure of today's webinar. So firstly, part one would be where, Tim sets the scene on why clause 10.2 matters today and why it's quite a rarely lived thing. Part two is where, when I was first approached with this project, I found the philosophical nuances behind it, where it seemed less about engineering and more about the contractual and almost political aspect behind it. So I'll kind of go into a deep dive of that. Part three is where we kind of have a look at the empirical evidence as to how that's applied today and why it does in fact work. Part four would be, back to Tim on what this demands of us as leaders in today's society. And part five would be the takeaway before we hand back to Glenn and the GMH team. And Megan would open the floor for Q&A questions. First, when we're setting the scene, kind of a general question is, how many people have sat in a project meeting where clause 10.2 was mentioned either directly or indirectly? And every NEC project does mention that we are in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. So I think in these moments, there's a key problem where we can talk about today. So here, let's just have a look at that quote, where the parties, the project manager, and the supervisor act in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. I mean, those 17 words is one of the shortest clauses in NEC 4, and I'd say arguably one of the most important. So here's what's interesting about how NEC structures this. Clause 10.1 is procedural. It acts as stated. It acts as stated in the contract, which is, a compliance baseline. Clause 10.2 is something different. It's less procedural and more of a behavioral obligation. And while it does, tie nicely with 10.1, it sits above procedure in my opinion. And it doesn't ask you not just what you do, but how you do it, and in fact, why you do it. Clause 11.2, brackets 13, often gets overlooked, and it defines the parties as the client and the contractor together, not in opposition though, and the key takeaway is together, which is a structural redefinition of the relationship before a single spade goes in the ground. So in the context of Hong Kong, in December 2024, the Development Bureau announced, the roadmap for full implementation, mandating NEC as the sole standard for all public works in Hong Kong from Q4 of 2026. So the GCC is gone, and now the NEC is the standard. And I want to address a point here that may come up in the discussion. Some will ask if clause 10.2 demands collaboration. So why does NEC also have option X12 for multi-party collaboration? And so X12 is an option clause where parties must consciously elect it, whereas clause 10.2 is a core clause. It applies to every NEC contract, just automatically. The existence of X12 doesn't dilute 10.2. And if anything, it confirms that the drafters recognize different levels of collaborative obligation, with 10.2 setting the universal behavioral foundation for all of it. One more point on clause 11.2 brackets 13, the word parties appears with a capital P throughout clauses 10.1, 10.2, and 11.213. The capital P, I think, if we're reading into it, carries the full weight of this definition, where it's the client and the contractor working together, not as opposing sides or even impartial parties to one another. So yeah, so the question is no longer whether Hong Kong will collaborate under the NEC, and that decision has been made. The question, and this is what it's really about, is whether collaboration can actually be governed, whether 10.2 can move from aspiration to genuine accountability between all members involved. And this has a direct consequence for the project manager. The PM is not intended to operate merely as an agent of the client, but rather an administrator of this unified relationship. So where a project manager operates primarily to protect the client's position at the contractor's expense, they are not just failing behaviorally, it's operating outside the structural logic of the contract itself. So if we move on to part 2, this is where I think, there's quite a lot of philosophical grounding in the NEC. So I want to spend the next, this next section doing something which might feel a little unusual for a contract law webinar. These thinkers that I'm about to introduce have never heard of the NEC, were born centuries before people thought of the NEC. And yeah, I think it goes to show the underlying importance of the NEC. And in fact, they were trying to answer the question clause 10.2 is trying to answer, many, many eons ago. So yeah, let's just move on to here. So on your screen, you will see a bunch of old figures of antiquity, some dating all the way back to the early 17th century, some to more modern times. And, we keep using these 3 words of collaboration, cooperation, and coexistence as if they mean the same thing, but it really doesn't seem to be the case. Coexistence is the most basic, I think, where parties on the same project, they share information, but only what the procedure requires. So there's no real share ownership of anything. So nobody's doing anything wrong technically, but I wouldn't call it working together either. So this fails clause 10.2. Cooperation, however, is one step up. So it's kind of, you do your bit, I'll do mine. We'll meet the obligations and we'll deliver on time. So procedurally, everything looks fine, but once again, something goes wrong. And when something goes wrong, the instinct is to, protect your position so you're not liable for anything, not to solve the problem together. So once again, falling short of clause 10.2. Whereas collaboration is, kind of the highest of these 3 terms, where it's the idea of solving an issue together, which is what the NEC demands. So collaboration really is what the clause wants. It's a shared ownership of challenges and open communication, even if it's tough and uncomfortable for the parties, where putting project outcomes above organizational protection. I think a simple test I'd offer to everyone listening is, if there's a problem on site and you ask, who owns the problem, if the answer is, not me, then I think we've already failed the collaboration test. So with this distinction in place, I think, yeah, we should finally turn to the 5 thinkers who can help us understand why this is the case. So let's start with John Locke and Kant. I think together these 2 thinkers provide us with the foundational ethics of clause 10.2. Locke is a political theorist and a a contractualist, which I think is very fitting for today's webinar. And Locke's core argument was that legitimate governance rests on the ideas of consent, fairness, and transparent rules. And when authority is exercised arbitrarily, and when the rules are applied in consistency, it ultimately loses its legitimacy. The people it governs no longer trusts the notion, and without trust, ultimately the system will break down. Now, if we look at that through the NEC lens, it's the early warning system, the risk register, the defined timelines for compensational events, let's call it. It's not bureaucratic hurdles by any means. It's transparent rules in which Locke makes it perfectly clear that there are obligations, and these obligations are clear and in fact predictable. This idea of predictability is the foundation of trust because you know what to expect from your contractual partner. But here's the failure mode Locke would then identify. Project managers who apply procedures selectively, Z clauses that extend control beyond any reasonable limit, risk registers treated as paper covering exercises rather than genuine risk management tools. And the mechanism exists, yes, but the governance discipline does not. And when that happens, well, trust would deteriorate fairly rapidly. There's a line of Locke's that I think applies fairly directly. He wrote that when those entrusted with power transgress the fundamental rule, they forfeit that trust, and it replaces the legislative with the project manager, and the logic holds perfectly. Now, if we move on to Kant takes it from less of a contractualist framework, but in more of a moral and ethical one. Who takes this from procedural fairness to something deeper, which is the idea of moral duty. Kant's magnum opus, as we'd say, is his book, The Groundworks. And in The Groundworks, he brings up the formula of humanity, which states to treat others as an end and never merely as a means. So to put this in less technical terms, every person has an innate dignity, and they're not instruments to be used for objectives. They are agents with their own rationality and interests. So in NEC terms, clause 10.2 isn't a tactical provision, but it's a moral commitment when we look at it through Kantian lenses. And when you withhold an early warning for commercial advantage, it seems like treating the contractual partner merely as a means, in which Kant would say that violates the ethical root of relationships. And there's a practical consequence Kant would point to, which is psychological safety. If people don't feel safe to raise concerns, if early warnings become strategic rather than genuine, the collaboration turns performative. The meetings happen, we go through the administrative stuff, but nothing real is being communicated. So I think the key question is this: if every party on every NEC project behaved exactly as yours does today, what kind of industry would we have? And moving over to Habermas, Hume, and Ardent, there are three more thinkers. I'll keep it fairly, just to not bore any of you, where they all add kind of a different dimension to the ethical and the contractual frameworks we've just heard from Locke and Kant. So Habermas has a concept of commutative legitimacy, where he argues that decisions are only genuinely legitimate when they emerge from open reasoned dialogue among equal participants, not from authority. So I think that applies to the collaboration bit really well, because every NEC meeting is a choice, and you can perform the ritual, or you can genuinely have a conversation and communicate. The contract creates these conditions. The people in the room therefore decide which one it is. Hume is more of a pragmatist, I think, and one that is very in line with commercial realities. Hume argued that trust is rational, not idealistic, but rational. So we cooperate because we anticipate reciprocity, where we act in a certain way, hoping that the others would do unto us as we've done unto them. Because parties who act in good faith build reputations, trust, and bridges. And these reputations ultimately open doors to future work, better relationships, and more of an efficient delivery. But Hume also tempers this by understanding the fragility of trust. And I think that's very important because, a single breach of trust can destroy what months of fair dealing built. I mean, engineering projects takes a very long time, in which trust is very, very important. And once the party defects, well, then everyone else would become rationally very guarded, which once again links back to what Habermas was saying about communication and the idea that genuine ideas must come from genuine communication. So Hume's point is that clause 10.2 cannot be understood as a mood you get into when you sign the contract, but rather a discipline as it comes from the idea of rationality. And where if you maintain it consistently through the entire project life cycle, well, then we'll have positive outcomes. And finally, we have Ardent, who makes, I think, the most philosophically striking contribution in this list of philosophers, where she draws a sharp distinction between power and violence, which is, a funny word to bring up in a webinar like this. But she argued that true power emerges from, concerted action, from people choosing to act together. Whereas violence, which includes the idea of coercion and the imposition of one's party will by force, kind of produces compliance, but not flourishing. So a client or a project manager who exercises authority through rigidity generates force, yes, but it doesn't excel because people merely comply, not collaborate. So in NEC terms, if what you say in the meetings and what you do in practice are two different things, there isn't real power. You've got compliance. And I think we've made it very clear that compliance is ultimately not enough. So what do these five thinkers actually demand in practical daily terms? Well, mutual trust requires four things. Transparency, which, it's honest, timely sharing of risks and concerns, not a selective disclosure, which is meant to protect a position. Consistency, where trust is built through repeated fair dealing, day after day, not through grand gestures once everything kicks off. Restraint, where you exercise your contractual rights fairly with genuine regard for the other party's legitimate interests. Not every right you have should be exercised to its maximum. And dignity, where you treat your counterpart as rational agents deserving respect, not as risk holders to be managed. That's Kant's direct contribution to how you behave in a meeting tomorrow morning. Cooperation also requires four things as well. So if we look on the right, there's active participation, where early warnings must be genuine, risk registers honestly, maintained, not exercises in documentation. Joint ownership, when something goes wrong, the question is how we resolve it, not whose fault it is. The shift in framing is the whole distinction between cooperation and collaboration instead of protecting your own grounds or finding a scapegoat. Proactive communication to go beyond what the contract explicitly requires when the project's interests demand it. That's Habermas. The legitimacy of your communication is determined by its openness, not its compliance, which once again builds trust, bridges, and a more open playing field. And the idea that cooperation cannot be one-sided and each party's willingness depends on the other's demonstrated willingness. The cycle must be maintained. And that's Hume's idea of rational strategy made operational.
Sean, a quick question for you. It's really interesting. You're talking about the philosophy and stuff, and on that last slide, the trust. Something that struck me as you were talking is that there's an element that trust has to be earned, doesn't it? It's hard to just we're arriving at construction projects. You can't just have trust on day one necessarily. Some people, I think, do, oh, well, I'll trust people until they give me a reason not to. But others are a lot more guarded, and that trust has to be earned. So I think that's something we maybe got to factor in, isn't it, on our projects, that it's got to be earned to some degree as well.
100%. Yeah, thank you, Glenn. The idea of trust being earned is indeed a very important one. But I think ultimately, if everyone, it's obviously, very idealistic for everyone to show up on the, at the meeting 100% fully geared up to, arms wide open and bear hugging everyone. But
That'd be a good meeting.
no, it would. It'd be a very friendly and cordial one. But ultimately, I think the philosophical groundwork for what we're talking about here is kind of a baseline of recognizing that every agent and every party needs to collaborate in a way that doesn't seem like we're out to get one another. If everything goes south, who's the one to take the blame? Is it going to be me or is it going to be you? And ultimately, if we go into a meeting with a framework of, yes, let's work together in a way that's conducive to both parties, not just mine, then I think the bear hug meeting can be achieved sooner rather than later. So here is the missing governance layer. And yet, I think the problem can be found here. Even if if you accept blindly everything I've just said, if you're convinced by these old dusty men from the past, none of it is, as Glenn said, is enforceable because the governance layer doesn't exist. So let's be specific about what's missing. There's no definition of what mutual trust and cooperation actually requires behaviorally. So there's no assessment criteria. So, how does one evaluate whether collaboration is genuine or performative? No guidance on what constitutes a breach of clause 10.2, no consequences for persistent non-collaborative conduct, and no real framework for measuring collaborative health on a project. And so this is the frontier, and I think the philosophical traditions we've reviewed today actually define what a governance framework would have to contain. So Locke tells us we need a definition, behavioral standards which are observable from day to day. Habermas tells us we need a certain form of assessment where, periodic collaborative health reviews looking at communication quality, early warning genuineness, and, project manager impartiality. Kant tells us, we need accountability. We need accountability where the project manager's performance is assessed against clause 10.2, not only against program milestones. Hume shows that we need consequences, a defined process where persistent non-collaborative work is identified and escalated if necessary. Hannah Arendt tells us we need promotion, where procurement criteria that actively rewards demonstrated collaborative performance, where it becomes less of an incentive per se, but more of a recognition that yes, we are on the right track. So yeah, now I've done a lot of talking about theory, but if we move on to the next slide, I think we can see these theoretical frameworks being applied in person.
Thanks, John. Once again, I think it is demonstrating that we are collaborating each other's. From this slide, as Sean said, he talked about a lot philosophy. What we want to demonstrate here that in 2023, I have attended NEC Martin Bryan Award, recognizing quite a number of projects I involved heavily at that time. When I was an executive director with Paul White and subsequently as a director of business development with China State Construction. In 2023, there were a number of projects. For example, the first one showing the finance bypass is 2.2 billion NEC Option C project. This project is a transport control contract of the a transport contract of the year. Hong Kong first horizontal bridge, rotational bridge above a live MTR railway. 2 bridge section built parallel to the live MTR metro. Then rotate over it within 2 nights. The project focused on the bridge rotation, and at that time was faced COVID pandemic. That level of innovation helped the project catch up the progress. The second one is Anderson Road Greywater Treatment Plant. The contract cost is not very high, 221 million NEC Option C project, but it is a sustainability award received, which is a Hong Kong first large-scale greywater system. Under cost 10.2, the contractor proposed switch to a turbine borer, higher upfront cost, but 25% long-term carbon reduced. Prefabricated rebars was delivered at around 30% above the minimum requirement. The third one, the Lok Ma Chau Loop, delivered by the contractor, CRCC Kunli Powai Joint Venture. It's a 3.6 billion project, NEC Option D. This is an extraordinary story. A cross-culture Hong Kong and mainland China joint venture that completed a 100,000 bed COVID emergency hospital in 51 days. 51 days, NEC provided the shared governance language across 2 very different organization culture. The fourth one, Yuen Long Effluent Porridge Plant, 3.9 billion Hong Kong dollar contract, NEC Option C. It was a water contract of the year, Hong Kong first energy nature wastewater treatment plant, and it is built on marble ground conditions. 4 projects, 4 philosophers, 1 course. I still remember standing at the award ceremony. I think if you have attended the NEC conference yesterday, the permanent secretary was there. But in 2023, the permanent secretary, Ricky, was also there. And he turned to me at that time and said, Tim, how many times are you going up there on stage? Yes, I went to the stage and I received number of award and recognition. But that moment said it all. Collaboration make it happen. In 2024, and I went to London again to receive the NEC Martin Bond Award, the Business Leader of the Year, runner-up. This recognized over 30 years of leadership in infrastructure delivery, NEC implementation, and collaborative governance. I think what this award reflects and what I have seen in how my works, what the Hong Kong experience teach. Let me reflect on what those projects actually taught us. Because Sean has mentioned it, philosophy beautifully, but there are things you only learn by living it on the ground. The first lesson is culture over compliance. In every case where NEC has struggled in Hong Kong, and it was struggled, the form was there, but the spirit was absent. Procedure followed to the letters. A behavioural behaviour maintained in practice. Procedural adoption is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Mindsets must change. The second is PM impartiality. This is the single most critical factor I have seen, where project managers were appointed from the client's own design team. They may have a conflict of interest, undermined trust before the project had really begun. The PM role demands independency, not just legal independency, but genuinely independency of judgment. It cannot be treated as a formality. The joint venture consists of 3 organizations, 3 different companies, involve 2 cultures between the mainland China and Hong Kong. One extremely challenging program. NEC gave them a shared governance language, but leadership gave it life. The contract was the container. What fueled it was trust. NEC provides the platform, culture, and leadership determine the outcome. A collaborative contract admin through the behavioral behavior will, over time, become behavioral in practice. The contract cannot save you from yourself. We cannot mandate NEC. We cannot mandate trust. That has to be built deliberately. And that is precisely why the governance layer Sean described is not optional. Not to govern who can collaborate, right? But to govern those who do not. Because without it, even NEC will be admitted through a traditional behavioral lens. Leadership and call to action. As Sean gave us a philosophy, we have seen the proof in practice. Now, what does it demand of each of us personally? Because culture trumps contracts, philosophy explains why 10.2 matters. But the leadership, yours and mine, determine whether it is lived. What does success actually require? On leadership, it starts with mindset. It requires genuine belief that collaboration procedure will lead to better outcomes. It requires listening before commanding. The leader I have seen success under NEC are consistently the one who asks questions first, who create space for others to surface problems before they become crises. It requires psychological safety. Your team must feel safe to raise concern and admit uncertainty without fears that it may be used against them. If raising any early warning feels risky, you do not have collaborative environment, and it requires courage. Even under commercial pressure, that's harder than it sounds. The industry has been doing things a certain way for a long time. On behavior, take ownership beyond your defined role. If the answer to a problem is not my responsibility, we have already failed, right? Fairness under pressure, in compensation event, in program dispute, in risk allocation, that builds the rational trust that collaboration through difficulty and consistency. Practice the NEC spirit every day, not just in a workshop, in a meeting, or in any ceremony. On culture, the goal is one team: contractor, the client, the consultant. Work under the shared goal, not just shared process. Early warning used generally, not strategically. Framework that reward collaboration, not just compliant, and behavior embed for the long term, beyond this project, beyond this contract. Because the culture shift NEC demand is not project level, it is industry level. For project to people, it starts with mindset, not method.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. So, I mean, we've done a lot of talking about the philosophy and, the examples of the awards. And just before I hand over to Glenn, I wanted to kind of tie it all together and say, well, ultimately, we need a sort of a definition, because without a definition, there's nothing to judge a project against, and we only use our instinct where there's a kind of a vague feeling about what is working, what isn't working, what's kind of working. But, you know, with a definition, we have a cohesive framework. But unfortunately, a definition alone isn't governance because nobody assesses it, no one evidences it, and there are no consequences attached to if we get it wrong. And that, I think, is exactly where the next conversation has to begin. I'll hand over to Glenn and the team at GMH.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Sean. Yeah, really interesting, thought-provoking. And I just wanted to sort of follow on, really, and just think about, okay, so it's hard to define, but what we can look at as what does it mean and what doesn't it mean? And maybe that in the short term, at least, might sort of help us to get to grips with what really does it mean to act in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. Well, it is things like being helpful, being considerate, being constructive and truthful for the benefit of the project. And that's the important thing. You know, the benefit of the project has to be the end goal here. You know, if one party wins, another party loses, is that success on a project? So it's got to be a mutual benefit to the project as a whole. Responding to communications as quickly as possible. And maybe a cloud-based system, Megan, might just help with such benefit there. But even within these, whatever your cloud-based system says the responses are, don't take the timescales you're allowed to. Respond quicker. So don't take 2 weeks just because you can. So if it would help to respond to something within 2 days, because that will help the other party to then do something forward, do it. Contractors, when you're submitting quotations, don't try and be opportunistic and try and see what you can get away with. Make them sensible, realistic from the outset. The project manager will then be more receptive and more likely to assess them fairly and importantly, quickly. One of the biggest projects we got in our industry at the moment, one of the biggest issues, we got in our projects at the moment is the unagreed change. Compensation events take months and sometimes years. You know, we tender projects very quickly, and yet we can't seem to agree a quote which is a fraction of the tender sum. So in this spirit of mutual trust and cooperation, we want to be able to find a way of getting through those quotes agreements quicker, and that should be a fairer and much better use of everyone's time. It is about creating a culture on the project where people are encouraged to follow the processes, just picking up on what Sean has just shared with us there, within the contract that are not considered aggressive or adversarial. To follow the rules of the contract should not be considered aggressive or adversarial. You can be contractually aggressive, but following the contract in itself is not being aggressive. Clear communications with good explanations and backup. So that spirit of mutual trust is explaining the communications you're sending so it can be better received, quicker received, not second guessed as well. And being open to talking and discussing rather than thinking that the issues are someone else's problem, not my problem. We've got to be real though. The reality is it's a commercial world and the contractor's in business to make money, but at the same time, they do want to forge good relationships. That's going to increase the likelihood of more work with their clients. And that's really what they're out for. You know, happy client, repeat work, profitable, then the world is going to be a better place in our industry. Any client is equally looking to get value for money, not have to pay any more than they think they should need to. So we got this conflict where obviously contractors are trying to make money, clients trying to save money, and all the while we're still expected to act in this spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. So the parties, we've got to look to strike in a balance between commercial advantage and true entitlement, whilst forging a healthy construction relationship to allow the project to be delivered effectively and efficiently. And sometimes I think it's easy to think what it's not. So what does it not mean? Well, to act in the spirit of mutual trust and cooperation does not mean relying on relationship and trust at the expense of actually following the contract. If anyone really pushed me and said, Glenn, you've got to choose either clause 10.1 or 10.2, I might shock you, and I might have actually undermined the webinar slightly by saying, well, if you're going to force me, I'm going to choose 10.1 to act as stated in the contract. Not because I'm unhappy with 10.2, but I think if you do 10.1, you were going a long way towards doing 10.2 naturally by following the rules of the contract, but they complement each other. So I'd only choose 10.1 if I had to make a choice, but the two work in harmony with each other, and they really do sort of the yin and yang, if you like, of our NEC contract. So don't rely on relationships at the expense of actually following the rules of the contract. To act in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation is in addition to comply with the rules of contract, and it is not and never was a choice between one or the other. Hence, NEC4 split that into two separate clauses. Hold back. It doesn't mean holding back on communications for fear that the other party might not like the amount of paperwork that's being generated. Again, the use of our cloud-based systems that we're generally using in our industry smooths the way a lot for that better now. One of my biggest ones, acting on a verbal instruction without it being confirmed in writing. Too often, contractors are being asked to, oh, just act on this and I'll follow it up in writing. They're taking a risk they shouldn't need to take. And in the use of these cloud-based systems, putting it in writing should be very quick, very slick, and not need to delay things. So do not think that to stop following the rules of the contract means you are acting in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. It isn't. I call it tough love as well. I'd say, with all due respect, I can't act on that verbal instruction until you put it in writing. You're helping to create or maintain the use of the contract. So you're actually a bit of tough love there. You could even send them an email to say, I think this is what you need to instruct us, copy and paste that into instruction, and we can carry on. So you shouldn't be expected to stop following the rules of the contract, and people hide behind clause 10.2 as a reason why you should be expected to do that. It also means you shouldn't give up true entitlement for cost and time, or just try to oppose or appease rather the other party. So really important there that just because of trust and relationships doesn't mean you should give up on your true entitlement. That is not what it means. So sometimes I find it easier to think what it doesn't mean rather than getting an absolute. I think it's very hard to get a true definition of what it would mean. So what it doesn't mean may be easier to focus on. And fresh from yesterday, I heard this quote only this morning. I wasn't unfortunately able to make the NEC conference yesterday. We hosted our own NEC People Conference on Tuesday. It's known in the UK as NEC Week. We've got two great conferences happening the same week. And Yoti Sedev yesterday on the stage in the Institute of Civil Engineer building talked about this. So this take on mutual trust and cooperation, it was really eloquently referenced with a reference to nature and the relationships between a flower and a bee. And you can see there on the screen. Yoti said, both survive because the other has something they need. The flower needs its pollen, sharing to ensure the survival of the species, and the bee needs to feed on the nectar to survive. That's the parties on a construction project, and a really nice, timely analogy. Megan, would you like to sum up for today?
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely fascinating discussions from all three of you there. I think, Glenn, you in my head going through the slides and going through the conversations, I was thinking of the things that Jyoti had said yesterday and shared. Interestingly, similar to that quote, she'd spoken about psychological safety in one of the talks that was on yesterday, and I know that Sean, that's something that you mentioned as well. So that was going through my head. So some really, really interesting thoughts, I think, and I'm sure everyone else did as well. A very big thank you to all of you. I think we do have a question waiting for us in the Q&A section, so let me just read that one out for us. It is from Laura McPhilly, and she has asked, so what happens when trust breaks down halfway through a contract? How do the parties gain this back with each other?
I think recognition, the very fact parties recognise it's broken down is the starting point, and then it's talk. Maybe sometimes we've been asked to come in to projects halfway through. We do training at the beginning of projects, try and set everyone off on the right foot. But I think at that point, maybe a third party, whoever you judge to be a good person to do that for you, let's get the parties background. Let's remind ourselves of the core NEC virtues, the core virtues we should have as people as well. Let's look at the problem and let's find out what the problem is. And sometimes, very often, it's just misconceptions that are in the way of actually getting back on track. And I think people have got slightly off piste. Yeah. They've just gone slightly off road. It's a bit of a bumpy road, and maybe we can just nudge them back onto that sort of nice, smooth tarmac. But all right, it's probably not going to be super easy, but talking, just getting, finding out what the people's problems are, reminding people of the rules, the NEC contractual rules we should be following, and that's the simplest thing but it's got to be done sooner rather than later. And it's never too late. I always say to people, it's never too late. Whatever stage you're on the project, don't be halfway through. You've still got half the project to build. So you've got to try and get it back. Tim, in your experience as a business leader, what would you say halfway through a project? What would your advice be?
The reason why I include some leadership idea in this presentation, because in NEC, leadership is really, really important, because give us a mindset over the method, fostering the psychological safety, as mentioned earlier, like earning trust through the fairness, the prioritizing listening over the commanding, the culture trump contract. This is the leader should do first, so the subordinate or the colleagues can see what is the atmosphere and can understand, can voice out without any fears. But having said, I would like to reiterate, having said all this in this presentation, the underlying message is we really need some governance. As I mentioned before, we don't want to govern those collaborative person, but I think need some governance framework to how to analyze whether he or she or they are collaborative. Otherwise, this 10.2 is just a word, just some words in the contract. It's hard to really help us if fail to comply with 10.2, and what will be the consequence, So
Yeah.
next step, I think we need to build up the frameworks.
That's true. I think auditing as well along the way, not to let it get in that state. I don't know if this happens, Tim, in Hong Kong, but in the UK, in the past, traditionally, the beginning of the project, everyone signs a charter. Everyone has a charter. Yeah, we got a charter. We're going to be great. We're going to collaborate, and everyone signs it, and the charter's on the wall, and that's where it stays. It doesn't mean anyone lives, breathes that at all. So we've got to check in. But don't just sign a charter at the beginning. Irregularly, monthly, bi-monthly, quarterly. Let's check in. Let's see how we're doing. Let's test ourselves on, are we doing that, and how can we improve? How can we do better? That's what I think we need to be doing. Easy to say, but not let ourselves get in that position in the first place. So let's check in, remind ourselves of those two clauses. Sean, anything to add?
What's you?
No, I completely agree. I mean, if it breaks down halfway through, you don't just kind of, well, throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's always chances for bridges to be rebuilt, which is fitting for an engineering webinar. And I think, yeah, as you know, the philosophy should not be lost on us, as not only, do we have a duty, well, Kant would say we most definitely have a duty to work in this collaborative manner. And if things go south, well, then we have a duty to fix it. And I'd agree with everything you've said and everything Tim said, in which, yeah, this idea of communication leads to effective collaboration. So thank you for that question.
Thanks to all three of you for such excellent answers to it. I think we have slightly gone over so far today, so I think we'll have to sort of draw it to a close. What we will do is we'll send out a recording of this session to all of the attendees, hopefully to those who couldn't make it as well, as I'm sure they'll still be keen to get involved in the conversation. We'll make sure that you've got the contact details of all of the speakers included in those notes. So if you've got any further follow-up questions, or you need any advice or support, we can make sure that happens after the session. A really big thank you to everyone that has attended, and a huge thank you as well to our wonderful speakers, Tim, Sean, and Glenn. Thank you so much for taking the time to deliver the session, and we will speak to you again soon.
Thanks, Megan.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Take care, all of you.
you.